Over the past year, I've done a lot of cool reactions, but as the year comes to an end, I wanted to do something a little bit different. For the past few weeks, I tried to think of some reactions that could be Christmas spirited or themed, but I couldn't come up with anything that I was happy with. A friend of mine suggested that I could make little ornaments by doing the silver mirror experiment in some small vials. I really liked this idea of chemistry-inspired ornaments, and I decided that I would make a small collection of them. In the end, I came up with 3 main ornament types. The ones on top are Christmas bulbs, which I took apart and did a silver mirror inside. At the bottom left, there's bromine, mercury, and uranium ore fixed in plastic, and at the right, there are some 3D printed metallic molecules. I chose to encase the mercury and bromine because they're the only 2 elements that are liquid at room temperature. The ornament seems so simple when they're just sitting here, but there was a decent prep behind all of them. I want to quickly go over how I made each of them, and I'll start with the bulbs. I could have very easily done the silver mirror in a vial, but I wanted to make things a little bit more special, so I settled on using a light bulb. To make the silver mirror on the inside of the light bulb, I'm going to have to take it apart. I was actually pretty surprised to see just how many guides exist for taking apart a light bulb. Most people take apart larger light bulbs, and I found that taking apart the smaller ones was actually a little bit harder. Anyway, following a guide on WikiHow, I was able to take it apart. The dismantling process was repeated 4 more times for a total of 5 bulbs. In this video sequence, you'll only see 4 being made though, because I made 1 off screen. The bulbs will have some broken glass inside, and they need to be cleaned out with distilled water. The clean bulbs are put aside, and it's time to make the silvering solution. The solution's a mixture of silver nitrate, ammonia, and sodium hydroxide. The common name for it is the Tollens reagent, and I posted a video about it a few weeks ago. If you're interested in knowing more details about it, I'll post a link in the description. The final Tollens reagent is supposed to be colorless, and I'm not sure why it has this yellow tint to it. It doesn't affect the mirroring process, so I just rolled with it, but I don't really know why it's like this. Anyway, the Tollens reagent is ready now, and I move on to adding dextrose to each bulb. When the Tollens reagent is added, it will react with the dextrose and the mirroring process will start. Using some plastic clips, I was able to conveniently stand up each bulb. When I was ready to go, I started to load up each of the bulbs with the Tollens reagent. I used a pipette here to add it, but it wasn't the most efficient method. Also, for the first bulb, I was kind of dumb and I filled it almost all the way to the top, and then I decided to try to mix things. I made a little bit of a mess, and I learned my lesson here. From the next bulb on, I mixed it when it was at around the halfway mark. By the time I finished filling the last bulb, we had a pretty good mirror going in the other ones. To let everything fully form, I let the bulb sit for something like 20 minutes and then came back. The silvering solution was then emptied out of each bulb. Each one was washed twice with distilled water, and then to dry things up, they were washed twice with acetone. The metal part of the bulbs are still opened up here, so using a pair of pliers, I close each one. Using a hot glue gun, I then seal the holes. I made mistakes with 2 of the bulbs, and some of the Tollens reagent leaked out and deposited silver on the outside. The bulbs had to be cleaned using concentrated nitric acid and some paper towel. At this point, the bulbs are ready, and I just have to attach a little loop of fishing line to each so I can hang them as ornaments. Not even 2 minutes later, I'm done attaching the last loop, and once this glue cools down, the bulbs are good to go. In general, I was pretty happy with the final results. The only thing that could be fixed a little here is my glue job on top. Anyway, out of all of the ornaments, the bulbs were the easiest to make, and I'm gonna move on in order of difficulty. So the next thing to talk about are the 3D printed molecules, and this was done all on the computer. The molecule on the right is caffeine, and the one on the left is actually NileRed. So starting with the 2D structured drawings of each of the molecules, I had to adapt them to 3D. The reason why this was harder than making the bulbs is because I've never 3D modeled before and I had no idea what I was doing. I chose to do caffeine because it's a cool molecule, and NileRed is what my channel's named after. A friend recommended that I use the program SketchUp, which is what I did, but it turned out to be a nightmare. I'm definitely incompetent, so maybe I was just using the program all wrong, but I ended up having a lot of headaches with it. After a few days of an intense struggle though, I was able to pump out a couple designs. I exported 3D models of each one, and then I went over to the site Shapeways, which offers 3D printing services. After uploading the file, Shapeways will automatically run some tests and tell you how viable your structure is. My structures initially failed, but after a couple hours of tinkering, I was able to fix all of the problems. Each molecule was printed in stainless steel, where one had a nickel finish and the other one had a gold-like finish. Anyway, it takes a little while to print metal, so I received them a few weeks later. As a quick aside, I'm gonna be honest, the sole purpose of designing these molecules wasn't to make ornaments. I got the idea of having molecule keychains, and I only came up with the idea of using them as ornaments about halfway through the design process. I want to be as transparent as possible, and I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking that I made this just for this video. Anyway, for those of you who are potentially interested in getting one, I'm currently making them in China, and they should be available in early 2017. Okay, so that's 2 ornaments down, and now we'll move on to the one that was the hardest to make. The idea of fixing some chemical samples in plastics seems simple enough, but due to a combination of incompetence and lack of proper tools, it was an absolute nightmare. To start things off was the easier part, where I had to ampule both mercury and bromine. Normally, I would just ampule things in test tubes, and I've posted a video about this before, but I can't do it in this case. Bromine itself is pretty dense at around 3 grams a milliliter, but mercury is just off the charts at around 13. With even the smallest test tube I could find, the amount of mercury that I'd have to put inside would be way too heavy for a tree branch. The best thing that I could use were disposable pasture pipettes, but I didn't really have access to any of these, so I had to improvise. I spent a long while just randomly walking around and looking for items in the pharmacy until I came across these little droppers. The process of turning these into ampules is pretty much the same as using test tubes. The only difference here is that one end is open, so I have to close it. Using a blowtorch, I heat the dropper end until it liquefies, and I have a good seal. Once the tip is cooled, I heat the middle of the tube until it starts to liquefy. I then pull both ends apart and I stretch out the glass. On a few of the droppers, I decided to completely liquefy the tip, which gave it a different look. This process was repeated 9 times because I arbitrarily decided to make 9 ampules. Once the ampules were made, it was time to fill them up. The surface tension of mercury is really high, and it won't make it past the narrow part if I just poured it in. For this reason, I needed to use a syringe with a needle and shoot it past this part. You might notice that this ampule has writing on it, and it's because the dropper I used had volume markings. Once I've added it, I need to use the needle to shoot mercury off the sides. The next step is to seal the ampule using a blowtorch, and I don't really want to vaporize mercury. The sealing process is pretty simple. I just heat the glass until it melts, and then pull away the top portion. You'll actually notice that the glass pops here a little, and it's because I overheated it. If the blowtorch is held too long, the air inside can start to heat up and expand. Once it had cooled down, I turned over the ampule to check the seal, and I was lucky because there weren't any leaks. I went ahead and filled 3 more ampules with mercury, and then I moved on to the bromine. What's kind of funny is that the bromine is stored in larger ampules, so I had to break an ampule just to reseal it in another one. This time, I had to use a glass pipette and not a plastic syringe because the bromine would react with the plastic. The bromine also fumes profusely, so I had to do this in a well-ventilated area while wearing a respirator. I filled the ampule about halfway, and just like the mercury, I melt the narrow portion and pull away the top. One important thing to keep in mind though is that bromine boils at around 59°C, so unlike the mercury, we have to use really cautious heating. Once everything cools, I flip it over to check the seal and make sure that nothing leaks out. This process was repeated 5 times for the bromine and 4 times for the mercury. I made 2 longer ones for both the mercury and the bromine, and then 3 smaller ones for the bromine and 2 smaller ones for the mercury. In the mercury beaker, you can see that I made 2 test tube ampules, but these aren't going to be used as ornaments. The test tube ones were used to make some decoration that I could put on my desk. Okay, so now to get down to business, it's time to do some arts and crafts. The ampules are going to be sealed in polyester, and to do this, I need to make some molds. The ideal thing to make a mold out of would be silicone, but unfortunately, I forgot to order some. I really wanted to post this video at latest on Christmas Day, and if I ordered it, I wouldn't be able to make that cutoff. So I decided that I'd make the molds out of foam core, and anything that sticks to the resin, I would just sand off. At the time, I thought this was a really good idea, but it turned out to be a nightmare. What I'm doing here is I'm making 5 different wells for the smaller sized ampules. I had 3 small bromine ones and 2 small mercury ones, so a total of 5. Using a razor blade and a ruler, I chopped up the foam core, and I put it all together using a hot glue gun. Once I was done making this mold, I moved on to making a second one for the longer ampules. So here are the 2 molds that I made. I randomly decided to make some fatter ones because I thought it would be cool. In the manual for the resin, it said that lubricating things with Vaseline was a good idea, but it turned out to actually be detrimental for me. It really didn't stop the resin from sticking to the sides, and it caused a couple other problems. So here's the polyester resin that I'm using, and it's from the brand Alumilite. In the box, we get small measuring cups, 2 bottles, and some popsicle sticks. To make the polyester resin, I need to mix an equal volume from both of the bottles. I start by pouring in part A until we reach the mark that I made. I'm not using a beaker here because it's a lot easier to just throw out whatever container that's used after you're done with it. To another plastic cup with the same volume marking, I add the part B. I then pour in both part A and part B to a third cup. Using a popsicle stick, I scrape out as much as I can from the cup. I then add the other part, and just like before, I use a popsicle stick to clean out the cup. Almost immediately after doing this, I realized that I was kind of dumb, and I didn't need to use a third cup at all. I could have very easily poured it from one cup to another, and I'm not really sure why I involved a third one. Anyway, now I need to thoroughly mix both of the parts together. To keep the amount of bubbles at a minimum, it's important to mix things gently. I obviously didn't do that here, and there's a lot of bubbles, but it's kind of okay because I'm going to be pulling a vacuum on it. I put the resin in my vacuum chamber, and when I pull a vacuum, a lot of the bubbles come out. After several minutes under vacuum, I bring it back to atmospheric pressure, and we can see that the solution is actually pretty clear here. To seal the ampules in resin, it needs to be added in layers. Once the initial amount has started to harden, I can place the ampule on top and fill up the rest of the well. As it cures, it initially becomes a very thick gel, and I was hoping to catch it at this point. The idea was to fill each well to about the halfway mark, then at the gel point, I could squish the ampules in. I figured this would be an easy way to center the ampules in the mold. Unfortunately, it cured faster than I thought, and when I came back, it was rock solid. Now that I can't squish the ampules in, I run into 2 problems. It's hard to position ampules on a hard flat surface, and also, since I can't squish the ampules in, they're going to be closer to one side. Anyway, at this point there's not much I can do, and I just go ahead and add each ampule. Once the ampules were in their wells, I went ahead and topped them off with some freshly made resin. I made sure that each well was full, and then using the back of a plastic spoon, I tried to straighten the ampules. I wanted to keep them as centered as possible, because if they ever go off-center, I'm just going to have to do more sanding. I then went ahead and placed all of the shorter ampules in the other mold, and again used the back of a spoon to straighten them. It was honestly a pain, and right when I thought I got things centered, the ampules would slowly start to drift. I had to come back every several minutes to straighten the ampules until the resin gelled and provided some resistance. Now it's time to fill the last 2 wells with some uranium ore. To answer some questions you might have, yes, the uranium ore is radioactive, and no, I'm not gonna die from handling it. The concentration of uranium in this ore is pretty low, so although it's radioactive, it's not radiating a crazy amount. Once the rocks are placed, I then pour in the resin. There's a lot of air that's trapped underneath the rocks, so using the spoon, I move them around to try to release it. I plan to cut these uranium pieces in half, so I pre-prepared a separation between the rocks. Also, I made sure to have a small gap between the ore and the wall because I didn't want to be sanding uranium ore later on. Once I felt I liked how it looked, I left it overnight to cure. When I came back in the morning, the resin had solidified, but the surface was still a little bit soft. I waited several more hours for it to fully solidify so that I could actually sand it. To start processing, I had to take the molds apart, and it turned out to be a huge pain. It turns out that foam core isn't the top of the line molding material. Using my hands and a screwdriver, I eventually tore off most of the foam core from each mold. I decided to start processing the smaller ones first. I felt they were a little bit long, so using a regular saw, I chopped a little bit off each end. The molds were then fully broken up, and each piece was processed individually. It's hard to see here, but polyester resin shrinks as it cures, so none of the sides of these things are flat. I don't have footage of the next step for the smaller pieces, but it's effectively me sitting over a garbage can and shaping them manually with a file. I had to remove a lot of the foam core that was still stuck and do a little bit of shaping. I think my ultimate downfall was that I decided to make 13 little pieces and this one big one you see here, instead of just making a few. In hindsight, I don't really regret it, but I really do question why I decided to make so many. In total, it took about 11 hours to demold, shape, and remove all of the foam core. If you remember when I molded things, I kind of screwed up and all of the ampules were closer to one side, so using the saw, I re-centered them. I was running out of time, so I did this all in one day and almost in one sitting where I didn't eat lunch or dinner, so it was pretty bad. I definitely could have found a power tool to make this more efficient, but I was committed to doing it manually for some reason. Also, in terms of safety, it's really important to wear a respirator when doing any sanding on these plastics because breathing in the dust is really bad. Anyway, after 11 hours, I was done with the bulk of the processing. Here I just show you one that I made with curved sides, which took a little bit more time than the others. The bulk of the grinding was done, but now I have to sand things using sandpaper. To smooth each piece out and get it shiny, I need to sand it with 4 different types of sandpaper. I start with coarse 220 grit sandpaper, and I move my way up to the finer stuff. The sandpapers that I used were 220, 400, 1000, and the 2000. In between using each sandpaper, all of the pieces were washed thoroughly with water. When I was done, the plastic is still opaque, and to make it clear, I need to polish it. I'm kind of a total noob when it comes to polishing, but I found a kit at the store that seemed to work pretty well. It's effectively just some foam that you attach to a drill. To get the plastic nice and clear, the most important thing to use is some good polish. I used plastic cleaner for cars, and it seemed to work pretty well. The brand in particular that I used is in the top left corner, but I can't pronounce it, so I'm not going to say it. Anyway, I did this for each piece, as well as one other polishing step, and I was left with some nice and shiny products. Here I'm just demonstrating what one of the bromine ones looked like. You'll notice that the surface is still a little bit hazy and it's not perfectly smooth and there are some scratches, but I mean, whatever. I'm not even remotely an expert when it comes to molding things in plastic or polishing them, so I was pretty happy with the results. Now I need to add some hooks, and to do this, I drill a small hole in the top. I bought some eyelets from the hardware store, but they were a bit long, so I had to clip them. Using my fingers, I then screwed it in nice and tight, and I was pretty much done. I added hooks to about 10 of them, but I didn't use all of them on the final tree. I added a loop of fishing line to each one, and at this point I was done. Just for fun, I added one of them to my keychain. To make sure that the hook didn't unscrew from the plastic, I solidified it with a little bit of super glue. Anyway, that's not really relevant to this video, but these are the final 13 pieces that I had. When we go back to the original ornament shot, you can see which ones I chose. This shot was taken before I dressed the tree, and I actually used one extra bromine one. Anyway, it's finally time to decorate the tree. I decided to start with the bromine, followed by the mercury, and then the uranium ore. Once these were in place, I put the bulbs on. When I was done with the bulbs, the last thing to put on were the molecules. I put on both the caffeines and the silver NileRed, and then I placed the gold one at the top. I took a step back, but I didn't really like how things were decorated, so I moved things around and I added an extra bromine. With all of the decorations in place, it's now time to add snow. The snow is made from sodium polyacrylate, which I got from paint hardener. Sodium polyacrylate can absorb a lot of water, and when it does, it actually kind of resembles snow. So I filled the dish with a decent amount of powder, and then I added some water. Quite a bit of water was added here, but the sodium polyacrylate was able to absorb almost all of it. I let it sit for a few minutes, and then using my fingers, I broke it up. At this point, it was starting to look pretty good, but the top layer was a little bit too damp. I added a little bit too much water, but it's not a big deal, and to fix this, I just need to sprinkle some more sodium polyacrylate on the top. I mixed things around a little bit more, and we're almost done here. I cleaned the base of the tree up, but I felt like it would look a lot better if the branches were snowy. To get this effect, I just sprinkled a bunch of sodium polyacrylate on the tree. At first I used my fingers to sprinkle it, but I got a little bit impatient and just started dumping it directly from the pouch. I cleaned up the powder from around the base of the tree, and at this point, I guess I'm done. When I first started this project, I wasn't sure how it would turn out, but I was really happy with the final product. Just to show you guys the radioactivity of the uranium, I'm using a Geiger counter here. It's kind of hard to see here because the screen isn't lit up, but the reading is around 80 CPM. The background radiation here in Montreal is something between 15 and 25 CPM, so 80 isn't that much more. Also, this is only when in direct contact with the sample. If I move the Geiger counter away, the CPM will drop exponentially. So this is basically to say that as long as you don't carry these uranium samples every day in your pocket, there's really no danger. Anyway, I guess this is the end. Oddly enough, this project was one of the most physically painful and long projects I've ever done. In the end, I don't regret anything, even though it cost me over $150 and a crazy amount of time. I wish you all a happy holidays, and especially a Merry Christmas because this should be posted on Christmas Day. Before the year ends, I'll be posting one last video, and I'll leave it as a surprise for you guys to see what it is. I'm just going to make the decision on the next one because I kind of forgot to include the straw poll in the last video. As usual, I'd like to thank everyone who's supporting me on Patreon. Anyone who supports me with $5 or more will get their name at the end of the video like you see here. If I made a mistake with your name or I forgot to include you here, please let me know by messaging me on Patreon. Also, if you haven't already, you can subscribe to keep up to date with every video that I post. I currently release one video a week, but I'm gonna try to release more.